Hello everyone, and welcome to another of my RPG lectures. Hi, I'm Jason Bulmahn. I'm the Director of Game Design at Paizo, the creator of the Pathfinder role-playing game, and I'm the team leader behind Pathfinder 2nd Edition. You might also know me from a lot of my streaming games, Knights of Everflame, Oblivion Oath, and now Band of Bravos on the Paizo Twitch channel. Today, I'd like to do a lecture with all of you talking about villains. For me, villains are a key component to any role-playing game story. A good villain will make or break your entire campaign. If your villain isn't strong enough, if that hook for your player's motivation isn't well-rounded and well thought out enough, your entire campaign can come off flat. The villain, in many regards, is the kind of crux of most campaigns. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about villains. I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of villains, the elements that make up a good villain, and how to play a villain. And once we're done with that, we're going to open it up for some Q&A here on Twitch. So for those of you watching on YouTube, these are recorded on Twitch every Saturday afternoon at 4 p.m. Pacific time. And if you ever want to take part in the Q&A, that's when you're going to want to be there. So let's get started with part one, which is the types of villains. And before I launch into this fully, I think I want to talk just a little bit about, you know, what's the point of a villain? Why does your campaign need a villain? Well, strictly, it doesn't. You can entirely just have a campaign with a series of monsters and minor part-time adversaries that show up, get properly dispatched, and you move on to the next part of the story. But I think a campaign is a lot stronger if there is some adversary that really gets under the player's skin. And monsters and one-shot bad guys really don't fit this role because they're not, frankly, on camera long enough to do so. It's hard for the players to form a connection with them and really get to the point where they hate that character, where they want to see that character undone. And to make that happen takes time. It takes planning. It takes a careful consideration as the GM. And I'll go into a lot of the kind of traps and pitfalls of making a villain, of going too far, of not going far enough a bit later. But before we get into that, let's talk about the various types of villain. Now, I think the most obvious type of villain, and I want to talk about big types and then kind of subtypes. And the big types is kind of how I break it down, how I classify my villains. And a good campaign will have villains of multiple types. But let's start out with the obvious, and this is the campaign villain. This is the overarching villain of the entire campaign. If you've ever played an AP from Paizo, they oftentimes have some overarching villain. It's someone who's behind the scenes from the very beginning, setting everything into motion. You probably don't even know about them until part 3, and by part 6 you're facing them down and bringing the story to a close. Campaign villains are perhaps one of the most challenging to design because they require a great deal of planning and forethought. They require you to understand the full breadth of your campaign and where you want it to go. And they are also the most frustrating for players to deal with, which is one of the reasons why they are so pivotal. Next up, I think next up is a smaller classification of villain, which is what I call a story villain. This is a villain for one part of the story. You know they're going to get dispatched. They're not really there to be a long-term villain. But, you know, they're the villain du jour of the current story. If there is a merchant who's been, skimming profits off of the local trade for years and using it to fund an illegal criminal organization, and you face up against this organization and realize the merchant is behind it, he would be the villain of that story. Maybe not appropriate for an entire campaign villain, maybe not enough oomph, but it's a villain for that particular tale. Although I should note, I've had more than one situation where a story villain becomes a campaign villain, but we'll get to that a little later. Next up is the villain of opportunity. This is one of my personal favorites. This is a villain that is basically created by the way that PCs interact with the world. This is that villain that you didn't even think of, but the players fixate on. It's some character that they suddenly just hate or despise. And it was never intended to be a villain, but all of a sudden it just got promoted out of being kind of just an ordinary NPC to being a bigger villain. For those of you who know the Knights of Everflame story, first of all, few spoilers, so you might want to skip forward like 20 seconds if you haven't seen it. But Lucky was a villain of opportunity. I didn't plan on that plucky little halfling being such a big villain. He became a big villain because of the way the PCs fixated on him and hated him so much. Was never planned. Villains of opportunity are something that you don't sit down and plan. You realize that one's been handed to you, put it in your pocket, save it for a little later, and then develop it between the next couple sessions and make it more than it appeared to be. If you're kind of an old hand at this, taking a villain and running with it is certainly, in the toolbox of being able to do it on the fly. But for most of you, it's okay to just identify it, kind of leave yourself a note that they really seem to hate this character, and, possibly promote them to villain status later. Next up is a classification of villain that I don't think gets enough attention in most fantasy RPGs, or RPGs in general, is the rivals. These aren't necessarily mustache-twirling villains. These are perhaps fellow adventurers, perhaps, someone in town, perhaps someone who just wants to see the players fail. But I wouldn't say that rivals are necessarily, the overarching villain of the campaign. They're just a thorn in the player's side. They always turn up in inopportune moments and make the player's lives kind of miserable. I think the classic example of rivals is rival adventurers. The players get to the bottom of the tomb, they're there to retrieve the ancient amulet, and they find the other group has already beat them to it, going in a different entrance, and has arrived at the end and is holding the amulet in their hands, preparing to take it back to town to retrieve the reward. And the players are left empty-handed. Rivals are great that way. Rivals tend to not live that long because the players find a good reason to kill them, but they can be a lot of fun if there's a good reason to keep them around. And lastly, and as far as the bigger types of villain, I think there's the personal villain. This isn't a villain for the whole group. This is a villain for one player. I generally like to have a villain or two in the campaign that is tied specifically to a player character or their backstory. I think villains that are built, kind of handed to you by the player, can be very, very powerful tools if used in the right way. Now, you can also, and this is the trick of all of these types, a villain doesn't have to be just one type, right? A personal villain can become a story villain for one story. And a story villain can become a campaign villain if it doesn't get resolved the right way and the plot carries on. A rival can become a story villain, right? That rival group of adventurers that got the amulet before you, well, turns out the amulet was cursed and now they all have lycanthropy. Great! And now that's another big problem and you actually have to go and take care of them. I think understanding that villains are mutable and can flow and grow is a critical part of understanding the villains in your campaign. I have more notes on that later, but I just wanted to mention it here. So that's what I consider to be like the main type, and that type refers to how they interact with the campaign on kind of a meta standing, not really as a in-world standing. It's not like they walk around with a badge on their thing that says, "Hi, I'm the story villain." This is more of a meta-organizational thing, because I think a successful campaign has villains in multiple types of these categories. You have a campaign villain, you have some story villains, you might have a villain of opportunity, you might have some rivals, you could have some personal ones. A campaign can have all of these. It probably can't have a lot from each category, but it can have some of each. Now, beyond that, talking more about it from an in-world perspective, not from your planning perspective, but from how how the players will actually perceive the villain. These are like subtypes, and there's dozens of these. I wouldn't pretend to catalog all of them, but there are a bunch of kind of simple, straightforward ones that I think of when I start planning a villain. I'll just kind of go through these and describe them. I don't think we need to spend a great deal of time on them because I don't think this list is by any means exhaustive. And to be honest, that's true of everything that I put in these. A lot of it's my thoughts and ideas on the subject, and you will find a great deal of other thoughts and opinions by looking around online. There's a lot of people who have a lot of thoughts on how to make great villains. I've learned from them. I hope they learn from me. That's how we grow as good GMs. So anyway, onto subtypes. I think the most straightforward subtype is I just call it obvious. It's like, oh, that's clearly the villain. It's an anti-paladin. It's a lich. You might as well put a mustache on the character so they can twirl it. It's a character that screams, "Hi, I'm a villain." I tend to use this trope a little sparingly. I think in some places it's pretty obvious, like the moment you put a lich in a game, that's a villain, But I think when it goes to like creating my campaign villains and whatnot, I tend to try and stay away from the super obvious ones. I'll explain why later, but I think the reveal is really important, and an obvious villain doesn't necessarily work. There's a very common villain trope, which is just like the schemer. And this is the character that they have some other position of power or authority, and they are scheming villainous plans behind the scenes. Not obvious, right? Because their entire facade is maintain an appearance of congeniality and friendliness, while behind the scenes manipulating people and events to some villainous aim. Beyond that, there is the truly invisible villain. This is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, in that you don't even know who the villain is. The villain takes a great deal of caution and preparation in making sure that no one can even identify who or what the villain is. There is some force organizing all of the bad guys in this region, and just finding out who it is part of the challenge. I think this might also apply to villains that whose entire design is one of obfuscation and misdirection. What next? Monsters obviously make great villains, and as kind of a subtype, just like this is a monster, it is a minotaur, right? In this case, if the type of villain is not kind of a humanoid, like an elf or a dwarf or something like that, the moment you make it a monster, that says so much about it as a villain and how it interacts with the world, that that's worthy of consideration. Another favorite subtype of villain of mine is the one that I like to call the untouchable. This is the villain that is in plain sight, is easily reached by the PCs, can be confronted with relative ease, but because of the situation or the social standing of the character or the world lore around this character, it just can't be touched. It's the king's son, the prince. He's not a particularly powerful character, but he is behind the scenes doing some pretty villainous stuff, and apparently with the king's knowledge. And it creates a situation where lowly player characters can't go and arrest the prince. That's never going to stick, so they have to find other ways to deal with the villain. I think these last two are some of my personal favorite subtypes. The first one is the misguided villain. And I think the misguided villain is the villain that thinks they're doing the right thing. They are going around purging the valley of all that do not believe in their faith, and this includes good people and bad people alike, and they do not discriminate. They are entirely misguided. I think these villains are the ones where you go, I understand why you are doing what you're doing, but what you are doing is wrong, and you just don't see it. Somebody in chat said Thanos. Kind of. I mean, I think you can pick apart that plot pretty easily, but yeah, I mean, that's the thought. It's the character who is doing something that they truly believe is for the best, that's trying to make the world a better place. But they're in reality being horrible monsters and huge villains. Now, the last villain that I think is worth talking about, and this one is my absolute favorite, is the Forged villain. This is the villain that the players made, and is my absolute favorite. If I can get the players to create the villain for me, I've done my job as GM, right? If the players through their actions send someone down the path of evil, and that evil comes back to pay them back in the future, it is one of the most rewarding experiences you can have as a GM. And the players will both be mortified and conflicted about it. So it's really worth doing, and if you can make that happen, you will not regret it. Okay, so to sum up part one here, we talked about the types of villains. There are the major types: the campaign, overarching campaign villain, the shorter term story villain, the villain of opportunity created by the characters and how they interact with the world, the group of rivals, and the personal villain, the villain that is personal to one character's backstory. Then, of course, you have subtypes: the obvious villain, the schemers, invisible villains, monsters, untouchable, misguided, forged. The great thing about all these, and you can add more to them, is that your villains can be any sort of mix or combination of these, right? Having a forged, untouchable campaign villain is a lot of fun. Not something you can necessarily set up from the outset, but something that you can grow into over time. So that's kind of how I like to start whenever I'm building a villain. Is what type of villain am I trying to build? There's enough tasks on the GM's plate to just kind of randomly start cramming things into your campaign. So the best place to start is just understanding what it is that you're trying to build. Once you've got that down, the next thing you need to do is to start picking the elements that are going to make your villain memorable. Because a good villain is a lot more than just a collection of stats and a bit of story. A good villain has a number of critical components that are going to make it resonate with the story, resonate with the players, and be a lasting, memorable part of your campaign. So the very first part, and I mean, it's obvious, but it's definitely worth going into, is just the motivation. Why is the villain doing what they are doing? Just being like, haha, I'm evil and I want undead. That's not really good enough. Villains need a powerful motivation for doing what they're doing. Now, that can be something very selfish, right? I'm trying to become a lich, so part of my lich formula requires me to slay 66 paladins. Great. That is perfectly fine. But I think it needs to be more than just, I'm here to cause mayhem. That's not quite enough. So starting with the motivation, what is the goal that the villain's trying to accomplish? Why are they doing what they are doing? And the key here is, if you can make it sympathetic, if the villain's motivation can be something you actually kind of understand. Oh, the villain is going around and collecting these magic relics and destroying the towns that are in them because he wants these relics, and these relics are built into the cathedrals. I don't know, making something up here. And but he's doing it because he wants these relics as a price to pay to the god that has his wife's soul, right? All of a sudden you're like, oh, that's a horrible thing that you are doing, but I can understand why you're doing it, because you want your wife back. Great. No problem. Now we've got something to work with. So motivation is always the best place to start, thinking about why the villain is doing what they're doing, right? You clearly got some story idea you want to do. Okay, cool, I've got, this orc horde is invading. Well, the orc horde is rolling down from the mountains. Their leader, their chiefess is crushing and rolling up the nearby towns. And you quickly come to learn that this tribe of orcs was forced out of their homes by giants that moved into the area. And they have literally nowhere else to go. They either have to come down here or they die. And you might be sympathetic to that because you understand that they need a place to live, but their methods are not exactly something you can tolerate. So, that creates the conflict. Next up, I think it's really important to understand that villains need an evolving story. This is arguably what sets a monster apart from a villain. A monster is put into your adventure, it sits in a room, it waits for the PCs to open the door, they fight it, and that is the end of that monster's story. Villains evolve. Their stories are not one note, like a monster is. This story, the story of the villains, in some ways, is parallel to the story of the players. Now, this might only be for a short part of your campaign, so if it's a story villain, it's only parallel for that story. For a campaign villain, though, it's parallel for the entire life of the campaign. So it's best to understand that your villain is going to have setbacks and successes, just like the players. But they tend to work in inverse goals towards one another. So when the villain has a setback, it's usually because the PCs have been successful. When the villain has successes, it's usually at the expense of the PCs. Doesn't have to be direct like that, but it helps that it is. And I'll get to why that is here in a bit. The final step of this is kind of the crux of it. But I think it's important that when you're building your story for your villain, the villain's story needs an arc and movements to it, just like when you would build an interesting PC. If I had a PC that was like, okay, cool, I want it to be, the oldest adventuring story in the world. I was a farmer, my farm got destroyed, so instead I picked up my father's sword and went off to be an adventurer. Over time, I became an accomplished swordsman, and then went back home, destroyed the monsters that ruined my farm, and I took my vengeance on them, and then settled down to refound the town and retire as a successful hero. That is a story arc, right? And that makes perfect sense for a PC. You might envision that as the story for your PC. You should do the same thing for your villains. Oh, this villain started out as a part-time crook in a town. He was just a pickpocket. And one day he got his hand on a ring that he stole from a nobleman that was being delivered. And he didn't know what it was for, and he didn't realize that it had a consciousness inside of him. And the moment he put on that ring, he was now in an endless struggle with this incredibly vile consciousness that, wants him to commit murders and is trying to rebuild a body that it can inhabit. And this poor, unfortunate footpad is now this thrall for this evil consciousness. And on one hand, his story arc is one that's sympathetic because he himself is not necessarily evil. Or at least not horribly evil, but he is being forced to do horribly evil things by this sentient ring, which is now, in fact, the true villain. And this story arc is now building itself, and there are acts to it and moments where it starts getting bolder, and then has more minions, and then starts growing into a cult, and there's all sorts of things you could build onto the story, but the point is, it's a story. It's a narrative. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what makes a good villain. Their story has to evolve, just like the player's story does. Next up, I think it's really critical when you're considering your villain to think about the notable details. And these are super important. Obviously you want your villain to have an interesting description, but your villain needs details that are unique to that villain, that will not be confused with other details. At least, maybe not at first. So this might be an affectation of clothing. This might be a color that they like. It might be some sort of sigil that they have on their gear. It could be their scent. Maybe they wear a certain type of cologne, or maybe because they are actually secretly a Medusa that always is wearing a hat, that there is some strange, spicy serpent smell. I don't know. Snakes don't really smell. But my point is, there's a lot of things like this. It could be a way that they talk, a way that they build sentences. Little details like this that set them apart from just the standard villain standing right next to them, or the standard monster standing right next to them. This is really key because these calling cards are vital at making the villain a bigger part of the story. So let's go back to this rogue with the ring, and the ring has this strange sigil on the gemstone, and the rogue is compelled whenever he commits a murder to carve this in the forehead of his victims. It's a way of siphoning out their soul power for the ring to use. I don't know, I'm making this up. But my point is, as the players are doing other adventures and they start finding these bodies with these sigils on it, they will start putting it together even though they've never met the villain. They will know that someone is behind this. You are building a portfolio of the villain in their mind by giving them dots that they can connect. This is really key because these sorts of calling cards and clues that you can leave in scenes and be part of the story are ways that the villain can interact with the PCs without being in the same room with them, which is really important. I'll explain later, but I'm wagering you can guess why. Finally, and when it comes to building the elements of your villain, this one is perhaps the most important, is how does this villain connect to the players? This is the part that makes the villain truly work. If I have a villain that I've imagined this villain who is wanders, flies from place to place in a tower that is unmoored from the ground and floats over cities and demands payment and tribute, and if he doesn't get it, he rains fireballs and lightning bolts on the poor townfolk below. Well, that sounds interesting, but if it doesn't relate to the players, if he doesn't arrive at the player's hometown, then why do they care? They might get hired to go deal with this villain, and that might make for an interesting story villain, but it's not really going to work for a big campaign villain unless it has a personal connection. Villains have to mess with the players. I mean, that's how this works. If my rogue with the ring, one of his victims ends up being, the player character's mentor, guess what? He now has a very personal connection to the PCs. In fact, although it should start unrelated, over time, the villain and their motivation and their goals and the way that they act should end up being directly at odds with the player characters. Best not to start that way, but you come to that. That is the moment where the battle is fully joined, where both sides are struggling against one another. The villain and the players are basically dueling back and forth. The villain taking tolls on the players taking toll on the villain. For those of you who know Everflame, it is Iculus to Lucky, right? Lucky became a very, very personal threat. He was a personal villain that became a story villain it was definitely very tied to the players. Tied to one character in particular, but tied to all of them in a meaningful way. It's this sort of connection that makes villains really work. The monster in the dungeon that's just sitting in the room eating a human that it caught is a monster. It's something to be defeated, but it's not a villain. If that villain is one of the player's squires, or if that monster is eating one of the player's squires, now it's closer to a villain. But it's you need that level of personal touch, that level of personal connection that makes it work. And arguably, if you even think about it in the reverse like that, like, oh, there's a monster and it's eating one of the player's squires, and that's a thing that happened, that almost feels disproportionate if it's not a villain. Right? That's like, oh, we ran into a random encounter and it killed, one of our favorite NPCs. Great. Yeah. It doesn't feel very satisfying because you don't have any connection to that as a villain. The sacrifice feels meaningless. But when it's a villain doing it, now it serves the story. So, to sum up part 2, the elements of a villain. The motivation. Why is the villain doing what the villain is doing? Make sure the villain's story is evolving. How does the villain's story change? A good villain will weather setback and has successes. I think there's something usually really important to note here on successes, because I think it's real easy for a GM to get lost in the thought of the villain has to succeed, which means the players have to fail. That's not always the case. I'll cover that more in detail here in just a moment, but just keep that in mind. Next, details. Notable details of the villain. Appearance, sigil, speech, scent. Maybe it uses certain types of minions. You know, there's lots of different things you can do detail-wise to make a villain kind of stand out. And finally, have a really solid connection to the player characters. All right. So, we've talked about the types of villains. We've talked about the elements of building an interesting villain. Now let's get to the important bit. Playing the villain. So you've got all your ideas for the villain, you know. You've got them all down on paper. You know what the villain, you know what their stats are. You know what their motivation is. You know what their details are. You know what their story arc is. You've got connections to the PCs, or at least you're going to be building them as you play. How do you actually play the villain? The first step in this is the reveal. Revealing a villain is something to be handled, especially when it's one that you're planning. I think this doesn't really apply to like opportunity villains, but a villain that you are planning and are intentionally adding to your story needs to have a slow, gradual reveal that builds over time. I am a really big fan, personally, of letting my players meet the villain before they know it's the villain. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this. You can have them not be a villain at first. You can have them be a villain in hiding at first. There's so many different ways you can do this, but the point is the players need to have a connection to the character before they know it's a villain. The standard default of most characters when they're playing a role-playing game is if they meet a bad thing and it is obviously bad the moment they meet it, the next thing they do is roll initiative. That's not necessarily what you want with a villain. Villains can't be one and done like that quickly. They need to grow over time. So having them revealed over time is kind of the first step of that. So if they meet this character and then later learn that this character, you know, like maybe they know this footpad. Let's go back to the rogue and the ring. Maybe they know the rogue. Maybe they, in fact, maybe the rogue in the group was a member of the same guild as this character, and then they just disappeared, and no one knows where the character went. I think there was a comment in chat about needing a good poker face for this, and I think you do. But I'm going to tell you one of my secrets later, which will explain why you don't necessarily have to. So the reveal of a villain is really critical. Doing it slow, doing it, rolling it out over time. But now that they know what the villain is, they know who the villain is, or at least they're starting to get an idea of it. The villain needs to win, sort of, right? For a villain to actually work, the villain needs to have success. I think you could make a very cogent case that you can have kind of a comic villain who always fails, but a serious villain needs to have success for the villain to be meaningful. It needs to have things that it is trying to accomplish that directly negatively impact the player characters. That's the only way that they're going to feel that the villain matters. If the villain is trying to raise the dead and the spell fails every night, well, it's not really that much of an urgent threat. But I think, and this connects back to some comments from earlier, this is a very tricky thing to set up, because it is far too easy as GM to say, well, the villain has to be successful, so whatever the players are doing fails. That's not the approach you want to take necessarily. You can do that, you know, sparingly, but I think for it to really work, the PCs still have to be successful in what they're attempting to do, but the villain has outmaneuvered them or is trying to do something different. There's a couple strategies you can invoke here, but the key is that their goals are not directly opposed. Oh, I'm trying to get this money and you're trying to get this money. Well, only one of us can get the money, so one of us has to win and one of us has to lose. And if the villain needs to be able to win, that means the players have to lose. And that's not fundamentally the way the game is set up. So, you know, having a villain who has multifaceted goals, you might be able to defeat one, but the villain is still winning on other fronts. People mention the Whispering Tyrant from Galarian. Absolutely. The Whispering Tyrant is great at this. This is something that liches are famously pretty good at, right? Which is, I have 14 different plans, and you can defeat one of them, that's fine. I still get to succeed at the other 13, and haha, I'm still winning, right? So I think it is important to, you know, set the goals of the villain to be such that the players perhaps are mitigating the success, but some of the success is still happening, or the various goals are not directly opposed, they're more parallel to one another. The players are trying to uncover the, you know, the cause of all these murders. The murders are still happening, and even if they manage to, you know, stop the rogue and kill him, they don't realize that the ring was the real threat, and it ends up on, you know, the cleric that was, you know, about to inter the body and picked up the ring, right? So the story can still continue. That is an interesting tale worth telling. They stopped the villain, but they actually had the wrong goal, if that makes sense. So, but this also plays into the next point, which is a good villain always has a backup plan, right? Oh no, you stopped me from getting this shipment of much-needed diamonds for my magic ritual. Well, you know, that's okay. You know, that's going to slow me down, but now instead my minions are taking over this mine nearby, and I'll get the diamonds that way, right? A good villain always has some backup plans up their sleeve to keep the story moving forward. All of this, by the way, kind of speaks to the main challenge of running a villain well, which is make the villain engaging without constantly frustrating all elements of the player's progress. That's what a lot of this speaks to, is the players still want to progress with the story. They still want to move the story forward. And you want them to do that because that's how they feel like they're being successful. But as GM, you also want to balance that with, how do I put a villain in their way who's going to stymie them, but they still feel like they're making progress against, right? They need to be having success, getting closer and closer to their goal, while the villain is getting closer and closer to their ultimate goal. So, and a backup plan is obviously a key component of that. Now let's talk about the thing that I'm sure you were all thinking about, and that is, how do you keep the villain alive? I think, you know, it is, I think every GM who's been doing this for a while has their own personal tale of the PCs who managed to one-shot their villain, or, you know, oh, you threw a disintegrate at him, I knew that was a possibility, but I'm sure I'm going to make the save, and then you bounce a 1, and that's the end of your villain, right? And there is an inherent desire in GM to just be like, nope, it failed, ha 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 ha, he's still alive, right? Because all of your well-laid plans are now down the tube. I think the challenge here is that you shouldn't have put the villain in that situation to begin with, right? The best way to handle a villain is to keep them out of combat until you're ready for them to be killed, right? The villain should be using minions, should be using indirect agents, should be using all sorts of tricks and tools at their disposals to avoid being in combat with the PCs. Surprise, there's a second villain, eviler villain inside the first one. You're not far off, chat. In fact, that is a big part of my next tip, but I'll get to that. And it's my true secret weapon when it comes to villains. But keeping them alive, I think, is one of the biggest challenging parts. You can, of course, always play the card of, well, it's a game with magic, so he's going to get raised or resurrected or whatever, or he's got a clone or a backup, or he teleports out just before he dies. There's so many ways you can, in a fantasy RPG, you can keep a villain like this alive that it's unfortunately a little cliche to do so. Right? I think players get used to being like, oh, great, okay, yeah, we killed him, but now we have to kill, his 14 clones, right? I think you have to be real careful doing that as a GM, and I think it's better as GM to avoid ending up in that situation to begin with. And part of that is just understanding how to properly maneuver your villain to avoid the fight until you're ready for the fight. And maybe, if you do have a setup that is like, nope, this is part of the villain's trap. The villain is going to have you fight a doppelganger who he has hired that looks just like him and sounds just like him and acts just like him. And the whole thing is to lure them into a trap. That's an interesting story. And then even if they do fight the doppelganger and kill it, they come to realize that this whole thing was just a trap to get them where they want to be. As a matter of fact, a good ploy is the kind of baited dungeon story, right, where it's like, oh, finally, we've been chasing this villain for 6 months, started the next adventure, we learn he's in this place, let's go get him. They arrive there, they walk into the dungeon, first room, there he is, sitting on his throne, ready to fight, does a cheesy monologue, they walk up, they initiate combat with him, and he dies. And they're like, awesome, we finally did it. And then they turn back around to realize that the door has closed. And they are actually at the start of a long death trap dungeon that the villain has set up to attempt to eliminate them. Right? That's fun. But once again, these are tricks you can only play like once. And I'm not talking about once per campaign. It might be once per that player. Because they won't trust you again. And that's the heart of the challenge with keeping a villain alive. Is the players have to trust you, and they have to trust you as a storyteller, that you're there to help build this engaging, rich story. And if the villain has a million get-out-of-jail-free cards, and you use them liberally, eventually they stop caring to some extent. They stop having that same level of investment because they can't seem to win. So it's best to avoid those situations to begin with. Let them have successes against lieutenants and agents, and let them build towards finally reaching the villain and have the fight that is meaningful, that allows it to conclude. That's fine, but you need to build for that and not just use cheats to get them out of trouble. So let me get you to my final tip. This is my favorite tip, and as GM, this is my secret weapon. It's all part of the plan. And that is understanding that none of your plans as GM are going to survive interacting with the player characters. They get to roll dice, they do random things, they go left when they were supposed to go right, they suddenly decide that that merchant who's trying to cheat them, who is your master villain for the entire campaign but hasn't been revealed yet, needs to die, and they kill him. And you're left kind of going, but it's all part of the plan. Just remember that mantra. It's all part of the plan. So when the players ruin your plot, instead of the knee-jerk reaction of being like, nuh-uh, I guess he still lives, move on to the next villain. Move on to the next stage of the story. What's the next stage of the story? You don't know yet. That's not important, but there is one. And if you do your job right, play your cards right, the players will never know the difference. So let me give you an example of what I mean by this. I had a villain, I had a plot arc where I had a villain that I expected the players to meet early on, and he was going to then leave them, and then they were going to find him later after he had evolved into a more powerful character. And in their first encounter with him, they ended up in a big massive fight. He was in the area, and they were like, well, we got to hit the bad guys, and they fireballed him and killed him. And they didn't know he was the villain, and I could have very easily been like, ha ha ha, he survived the fireball, but that would have played my hand because he was supposed to be an ordinary, common, like, townsfolk at that point in time. But the point is, he was dead, and, you know, that whole plot died with him because he was gone now. So, you know, my next move was to be like, well, the person who was, you know, behind him and was guiding him to evil is now the one who's really behind this, and it was all part of my plan all along. That guiding evil mentor never existed until he died, right? And that's the trick as GM. You can always move on to the next villain. If they kill the character, if they manage to succeed when you had the odds stacked up against them, but they managed to roll enough 20s, right? You can always move on to the next thing, and that can always be the next villain, and it always was. That was always part of your plan. The villain that you thought was going to be the main villain, ha! Nope, not him. That was the lieutenant, right? If we go back to the thought of the rogue with the ring, who's going around committing grisly murders and leaving sigils in people's foreheads. Let's say the players managed to luck out. You're like, oh, he's trying to get away, and you're doing a chase, and you think, oh, he's got them crushed. He's got such good skills. I want to give him a chance, but he's going to get away, and they'll just get a fleeting glimpse of him. But then they pull some trick out of their back pocket, and they manage to catch him and kill him. Well, now your whole story's over. Your whole campaign is laid waste, except that it's not, right? Oh, they turned the body over to the local temple to be buried. The problem solved. Except for the fact that they didn't really realize that the ring was actually the problem, and now it's on the cleric who interred it, and the murders start up all over again, and now that was the villain all along. And you planned it that way, but you didn't, and now it's just going to work that way, but that was all part of the plan. It's all part of the plan. That's what you got to remember as GM. You control all of this, so you need to figure out a way to keep the story moving, to keep it going, to find the villain behind the villain. There can always... Villains are like an onion. You peel off a layer and you can find more villain underneath, right? And how deep that goes is wherever you need your story to go. So that's my secret. I figured. But you can too, and that's the best trick about being a GM, is that you control these elements and you know where the story was supposed to go, and it's easy enough to alter things that the players have not interacted with yet in a meaningful way, and you can allow your story and your campaign to evolve in the directions that it needs to. So, to sum up, playing the villain. First of all, there's the reveal. You want to drag that out. You want to let them get to know the character before you know, they finally realize that it is a villain. You want the villain to win, sort of. You know, its goals have to be accomplished for it to actually be a credible villain. But those don't have to come at the cost of the player's success. The villain needs good backup and contingency plans. They don't need an answer for everything. They definitely shouldn't have an answer for everything. But they should have an answer for the most obvious thing that can go wrong, right? If they're, you know, if this villain is on a boat and is being chased by the PCs, the most obvious thing is that the boat gets caught. Well, how does the villain get out of that situation, right? That would be the first thing the villain thinks of before they get on the boat. The villain needs to stay alive, and it's more than just raise dead, right? Don't put the villain in situations where the villain's going to die until you're ready for that as a possibility. Let that build over time. And finally, it's all part of the plan, or how I learned to stop worrying and love the dice, right? The dice are going to screw you. They're going to change your plot. They're going to change your story. You got to be nimble on your feet and pick up the pieces and keep things moving along to your ultimate goal, right? Which is to tell a compelling, engaging story with interesting villains. So, you know, peel that onion one layer deeper and find the next villain that lies inside, more stinky than the last. All right, everybody. I think that about wraps it up. I'm going to open it up for some Q&A here. We only got about 10-ish minutes for Q&A, so let's do a little Q&A from folks in the chat. And I'll go ahead and bring up the chat box. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them in chat, and I will see what I can do about answering them. Let's see here. Strange love quote. Yeah, well, you know, it seemed apropos, considering. Yeah, that's a good note for anybody who misses my lectures. You can either catch it video on demand here on Twitch, or every Monday I load these videos up on my YouTube channel. I'll edit them and cut them down, and they go up on my YouTube channel. They've been a very popular addition to that channel. So, what's my favorite villain I've played thus far? What's my favorite villain? That's a tough question. I think most recently the play of Lucky in the Knights of Everflame was kind of a delight. I had a lot of fun playing him. I liked the voice, the affectation. I love the fact that he was so smug and always one step ahead of the players until he suddenly quite seriously was not. I really like how that story played out. I won't spoil it, but the way that villain was handled was kind of all of these tips rolled into one. So I thought it was a lot of fun. So let's see. How do you keep good big villains in a sandbox campaign, knowing the players are wild beasts likely to go wherever they want? I think in those situations, you just need to understand that the players are a force of chaos, and even if they encounter the villain, they don't necessarily have to encounter the villain, right? This is a trick that I've used as GM for a long time, especially in kind of open world things. If I know that I need the players to go to the Keep of Forgotten Mists, and it's in this square on the map, and the players don't go to that square on the map, they go to the one next to it, guess what? The keep just moved to that square. You can always kind of shift and adjust things over time to make it all work. I think, making those characters relevant in a giant sandbox campaign is all about making them present. This goes back to the fact that villains need notable details and henchmen and things that are recognizable, so you can have their influence be in multiple places. You can have them be a force that the players face off against more than once. Because they're facing off against lieutenants and monsters and other minions, but you get this sense that they're all serving one more powerful master, and you just haven't found a way to track them down yet. Yeah, I mean, ultimately that is it. It's about making sure that the players and the villains interact with one another, but the villain shouldn't do so directly, not at first. That's the way to make that kind of work. Yeah, Lucky's a delight. There was another villain from my past, talking about villains that the player characters make. In the early days of a long-running campaign back when I was in college, I had the very first adventure, the players were going off on an entirely unrelated one-shot adventure. And on their way there, they got to a crossroads. And at this crossroads, the local magistrate had put up a crow cage. Just a cage where they put petty criminals and leave them in this cage to kind of rot. Sometimes they die, sometimes they don't. Next time the magistrate comes by, he lets them out. And that's just the way it is. And they got to this crossroads, and there's this poor, pathetic wretch in the cage who was begging for water and maybe a bit of bread. And, the players were like, well, he's obviously done something wrong because he's in the crow cage. But they took some pity on him and gave him some water and some bread. And when they came back from the dungeon, they saw that somebody had come by and broken off the lock, and whoever was in that cage was now gone. That character ended up being the major villain of the entire campaign. He was put there for a very, very good reason, and he only survived because the characters gave him bread and water. And in a way, they ended up kind of feeling responsible for him. Now, he went on to do a whole lot of crazy villainous stuff, but that was their first introduction to him, was as a small-time criminal in a crow cage. And that's it. And they gave pity to him. And that was the last time they ever gave pity to him. Every time after that, they were like, oh, that guy. You know, so I think doing things like that, making your villain in some way sympathetic, even if only temporarily, is enough to really get under the player's skin, because that's not an emotion they like to have towards villains. I find that in most tabletop role-playing games, villains monsters are very one-dimensional, right? They're a threat that pops up, you punch them, money and XP falls out, and you move on to the next one. That's not as compelling of a story as a villain, right? A villain needs nuance. A villain needs a more complex narrative. Do you prefer to play a villain focused more on intrigue or more on raw combat power? I think it really depends on what I'm trying to accomplish. I do love a villain that is like, now this is the like 80-year-old vizier. If you go up and punch him, you're going to take him out. That's fine. He's not that powerful. But he wields significant political authority. He wields, you know, he has an entire cadre of mages who answer to him. He himself is an accomplished spellcaster, but he's not the most powerful character. The player characters can beat him up. I love villains who sit in that space, who are so powerful in ways that aren't statistics, that they are formidable in ways that the players don't necessarily have the tools to deal with, right? That's one way to make a villain very compelling, because they don't have a stat that is ruin reputation. You know, oh, I took the ruin his reputation feat, so we're good. That's not a thing the players have. They have to work at dismantling power structures to get at this character. More than one big bad per campaign? I actually think you should have multiple villains in your campaign. I think you probably don't want more than one overarching campaign villain. I think that's a bit much. But you can have villains of a story and villains of a personal nature, right? If you go back to the start of this lecture where I talked about villain types, I think you want villains of multiple types in your campaign. You want a villain that's a personal villain to the player characters. It could just be, that could be like the bully from when they were a kid. They've grown up. They're adventurers now. He's still the town bully who beats people up for their, you know, for their lunch money, and they go back and teach him a lesson. Little do they know that in the intervening years, he's, you know, picked up, you know, I don't know, he's gotten a berserker axe now, and now he's a real threat, right? But I think there are ways to keep those sorts of things interesting. The player characters can certainly pay attention to more than one villain. But the upside about having lesser villains is that they can be dispatched and the story still carries on. Yeah, exactly. Like I said, yeah, you can have more than one villain, because if you do, then they can defeat him, and your campaign continues. Yeah, well, that's one of the joys about having lesser villains, is that they can quickly come to realize that the person they've been struggling against this whole time isn't the person behind all this. Right? And there is something powerful about that reveal, that it took all of their might to defeat this character, only to learn that this is a stooge in the inner circle of this cult. This was the weakest, and now you have to go on to the next one who's even harder, and it's going to take even more of your skills. I think that's powerful. I think you have to be careful with that, because obviously, the moment that reveal happens, you do want to include an idea of the total scope, because you don't want to keep shifting the goalposts. Like, remember, it is all part of the plan. That's your mantra. But if it keeps happening, eventually your players will start losing their suspension of disbelief that the goalposts for when they actually get to the bottom of this organization continues to move. And don't be afraid to say that the big campaign villain that dies at 7th level and the campaign continues onward, that's okay too. That campaign villain was just the campaign villain for the first half. There can be a new one you can establish. The story can go on. That, too, is all part of the plan. Do I have any tips for working villains of opportunity in published adventures? Yeah, it's actually really easy. Well, villains of opportunity are presented to you. That's the great part about them. It's the thing that the player characters identify with. And then it's just a matter of working them into the adventure or setting them aside and making them a villain for later, right? Understanding that, oh, this character that was in the middle of this adventure, you know, they're playing Plaguestone and they really get tired of the sheriff, right? This guy has been a thorn in their side the entire time. He's constantly yelling at them and berating him, and they really hate this guy. He's not the villain of that adventure. Spoilers. It's obvious from the beginning, but he's not the villain of the adventure. So, I mean, having him show up at the end and suddenly be a villain doesn't make any sense. But saving him for later, for the next story, makes perfect sense. So sometimes you just gotta, you know, put things in your pocket, use them later, continue having the characters be an antagonist, and then use them when the time is right. Alright. Well, I think that about does it here for today, everybody. I want to thank you for participating in this lecture here today. It's been a blast talking to all of you about villains. I want to remind you that all of my previous lectures, including building one-shot games, doing sessions for just one player, building compelling PCs, the basics of world building, all that stuff is available right now on my YouTube channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's probably going to be suggested to you in just a moment. So feel free to stick around and catch some more tips. Thank you for watching, everybody. If you want to hear more about me and Pathfinder and what I do, you can follow me on all the various social media channels, /Jason Bulmahn, Bulmahn. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And thank you for watching. We will see you next time.